Hi. Have you heard of Bathsheba? You know, that woman in the Bible in the Old Testament, the most famous and controversial wife of King David. The reason she was because their marriage took place at the height of King David's reign, right after their extramarital affair. You know, 2 Kings chapter 11 tells us a story. Instead of being out leading his men into war like a good king should have been, King David, maybe he felt secure, maybe he just knew he had a good commander in Joab, decided to stay home for the war season. And chapter 11 tells us that it happened one day, one evening, that he arose from his bed and he looked out and he saw a beautiful woman taking a bath. Well, King David's palace was high above all the other houses. So it was only natural that he would look not only into Bathsheba's home, but into the homes of many of the other subjects around him. And it says that he happened to rise from his bed. Now, we're not talking middle of the night here because the Bible says this was evening. In the Jewish society, evening starts at 3 p.m. Yeah, I know that's a little strange for our mind, but that's the beginning of the next day for them as they get ready for the next day at sundown. And many of the Hebrews would take an afternoon nap in the cool of the day, especially during the summertime, and then they'd be up, refreshed, ready to do some things that evening before nightfall. King David did that. And while he's out walking on his palace, he just happened to see this beautiful woman. The Bible doesn't say a lot about appearances, but it tells us that both David was good looking and Bathsheba was very beautiful to behold. Now that word behold means to watch, to look at, to keep on looking at. So he didn't just take a glance, he really saw her, okay? And there she is. She's taking a bath. Now, in the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus gives the instructions that every woman, after she has her monthly cycle, 7 days later, she's to take a purifying, cleansing bath. This is in the law. All women are supposed to do that. And they even have a special place set up, like a special bathing area or bathtub for it. So this was probably what Bathsheba was doing that afternoon. But now, who was Bathsheba? What do we know about her? I mean, because it just says Bathsheba here, and you'd think, well, she could be a harlot, she could be a prostitute, she could be anybody. No. David asked his servants that very same thing. He says, who is that woman? And they said that she's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Well, Uriah the Hittite, this was one of David's generals, one of David's mighty men who was off to war on behalf of David. But not only that, it says that she was Bathsheba, which means daughter of oath. And this is derived from the Hebrew words meaning daughter, and Sheva, which is translated seven. So actually, Bathsheba's very name represents God's day of rest. She was a beautiful woman who, from her name, was filled with peace. She was one of only 5 women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy. So as the wife of King David, she would later become, and the mother of King Solomon, this put her directly in line for Jesus' genealogy, a direct ancestor of his. So she holds a very unique place, both in the Old Testament and in the genealogy of Jesus. But it would be very easy to just overlook her, just see her as either that poor victim that David raped or the woman who seduced him and caused his fall. But the Bible doesn't really say that, and it doesn't tell us a lot about their relationship before they met. We don't know that David and Bathsheba had ever actually met in person before that night, but we do know because of their family ties, David was at least aware of her, and of course, being king, Bathsheba knew who he was. Who was Bathsheba? She was a daughter of Eliam, and he was one of David's mighty men in 2 Samuel 23:24. So her father's name actually has the meaning of the people of my God, or the God of my people. And the name expressed the covenant. I will be your God, and you will be my people. So she's the daughter of a godly man who's one of David's mighty men, probably also off to war. But more than that, her grandfather was Ahithophel. Now you think, who in the world is Ahithophel? Well, Ahithophel became David's counselor, which really gave him more importance or more influence in David's life than even the priests had on him, than the prophets. And years later, as we'll see when we get farther on into the story, he became Absalom's counselor when Absalom tried to overthrow the kingdom. Perhaps Ahithophel did all of this because he thought, I know what you did to my granddaughter. I see how you treated her. And this is exactly payback. It's what you deserve. Well, more than having a godly father and a godly grandfather, tells us that she's the wife of Uriah. And many people have tried to excuse Bathsheba and David because Uriah was a Hittite, and saying, oh, he was a cruel man. He was probably dirty and smelly. I mean, I've heard all of this about how a Hittite was an enemy of God. But let's look at Uriah and his name, because in the Bible, names are extremely, extremely important. Uriah's name means Yahweh is my light. This was a Hebrew name. And so it lets us know a few things. First of all, Uriah probably did not come from those Hittites that were enemies of God during Joshua's days. But he probably actually came from northern Syria, where either his family had immigrated from or he was a mercenary into Israel. Either way, he had a long history in the culture of Israel. And not only that, as a mighty man of David, he had a long history of David that went back even before David got to be the palace. He would have been with David when he was running away from Saul. He would have been with David when David asked for a drink of water from the pool of Bethlehem, and it came back to him. And he would have watched David as he poured it out and said, no, I can't even take a drink of water because it would have cost a man his life. He knew from his past the integrity, the heart for God that David had. And now, because of that, Uriah is off to war. Bathsheba is selflessly serving her king, his king. And he's doing it without thought because he knows the history of David. What he doesn't know is the future of David and what's happening currently. What's happening currently? Well, David finds out, all right, who Bathsheba is. But it doesn't stop him. He has seen her, and he's desired her, and he's putting those thoughts into action. And it says then in verse 4 of chapter 11, then David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. So, this says that David sent messengers to get Bathsheba, and that she went. But it doesn't say that she went of her own free will. Think if you were Bathsheba. You hear the knock on the door. And either you or perhaps even one of the servants opens the door to see messengers, plural, more than one, who have come from the king. And they've come from the king to tell you that the king wants to see you at the palace. Now, they didn't say why he wanted to see you. Maybe they were smart enough to figure it out, and maybe they weren't. However, all they said at that point was the king wants to see you. And the king had such great power that not to go along with him could have meant either imprisonment or death. And so she would have had to have been either very strong-willed or very persuasive not to go. Like her husband Uriah later on, she had little choice in the matter without risking death and defying his orders. But you see, the main thing is, at this point, Bathsheba had no reason to suspect that this man who had been so honorable before her husband, before her father, before her grandfather, and before the nation of Israel and before the God whom he served, would be any less honorable with her. So, from this point, it really is difficult for us to know what Bathsheba's part in all of it was. Some say David sinned big time, but he was no rapist. And others argue, no, Bathsheba was a victim of power rape. Many call her an adulteress. And then we see that definition of power rape. And does it apply to Bathsheba here? Was someone who had more authority over her, causing her to act in a way that she did not want to and never would have acted except for the power that that person held over her? Was David using his power as a king to take advantage of Uriah's wife? Well, the text doesn't say that David did rape Bathsheba. But then again, neither does it blame Bathsheba for her action. David was the one that Nathan came to see later. David was the one that at the end of this chapter, it says God was very displeased with him. So nowhere is she condemned as sinful. So did she sinfully seduce him? After all, she was taking a bath on a rooftop across from the palace. But there again, she was doing her monthly cleansing as required by the law. And this purification was probably the bath that David saw her performing on the roof. And because of her taking the bath there, this has led many to believe, she did it on purpose. She had planned for that. She had been doing it. And she set the time for it. But then we have to look at the verse back in chapter 2 when it says, then it happened. She was not expecting David at that time. She was not expecting him to walk out at that moment on the roof. And not only was she not expecting it, David certainly had not planned for it to happen. But what we do know, even though we don't know her part, or even David's part, whether it was seduction or rape, we do know sin has consequences. And in verse 5 it says, the woman conceived, and so she sent to the king and told him, I am with child. This is the only time that we hear Bathsheba's voice in this entire chapter, as she sent that message announcing her pregnancy. Bathsheba's always been at the mercy of men in her life, raised by godly men, married to another one, and now her husband, when he finds out, he has a choice. He can take her life when he hears of her pregnancies. And she cannot appeal to anyone. She can't even appeal to the law to protect her as an innocent victim, because it was the king who violated her. And so Bathsheba waits. She waits for her future to be decided by the choices of both David and Uriah. So, in effect, she has taken the problem to the king and said, look, we need to take immediate actions. This was the only way that the king's honor would be preserved and their lives. Leviticus 20:10 is very, very clear. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer, David, and the adulteress, Bathsheba, shall surely be put to death. Hey, there's no loopholes here. There's no way to get around it. The law is very clear. Both parties, man and woman, have to be put to death. The law might be clear, but in practice, as we see in the New Testament with Jesus in John chapter 8, when they bring the woman caught in adultery, it was usually the woman who paid the price. And Bathsheba right now is in a very precarious situation, because everybody knows, whether they know about her spending the night with David or not, they all know her husband is away at war. So David does some calculating. The pressure's really on him. And then verses 6 through 11 of 2 Kings chapter 11, David starts thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I mean, he could have hid the affair with Bathsheba, and maybe no one would have ever known. Maybe the servants who suspect it would never have told. But hiding the pregnancy, that's a different story, and it can't be hid for long. Yet, instead of owning up to their liaison and that affair that they had and repenting, he took drastic actions as he tried to do a great cover-up. He thought, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll get Uriah to come home. If Uriah comes home, then he and Bathsheba can get together, and he and everybody else will think it's his child, and problem solved. I don't have a thing to worry about. So he called him in and said, Uriah, tell me about the war. Now, for a mighty man who's a general to come in just to give a war report may have seemed a little strange, but Uriah, who had no reason to suspect his great friend David, gave the report. And then David said, well, thanks a lot. You know, you've worked so hard. You have been so faithful. Why don't you take leave for a few days and just go to your wife? Uriah was much too honorable to do that. The next day, King David found out he had not gone home to sleep with his wife. He said, Uriah, why didn't you go? He said, but King, how could I go? all the armies of Israel and Joab are sleeping in tents out in the field, and the ark of God is there. How could I go to my home and sleep with my wife? Not only did David ponder this question and become greatly angry, but Bathsheba knew he was in town. Imagine you're Bathsheba. You're at home, waiting. You're waiting in fear that he might come and find out. You're waiting in anticipation, hoping that this matter will soon be over and you and the king will be able to continue your lie and your husband will never know whose child it really is. But then, as Bathsheba watched the clock, whatever kind of clock they had back in those days, or whatever, maybe she just listened to the cock crow. Later and later it got, no Uriah. There was no way out this night for Bathsheba. A sleepless night ended in misery and greater concern. The next day, King David called Uriah back to him. He thought, well, this man of virtue, he won't do it on his own will, so let's have dinner and get him drunk. He gave him lots and lots of alcohol, thinking that the alcohol would lower his resistance and increase his desire. Neither one happened. Even though he was drunk, Uriah was still more honorable than David. And once again, he went back to the king's barracks and not back to Bathsheba. Bathsheba, she's anxious, doesn't know what to do. She knows her husband's in town. And at this point, perhaps her only thoughts are, maybe the neighbors won't know where he spent the night. Maybe everyone will not realize that he did not come to see me. Maybe they'll think, perhaps, that he made a quick visit home. The next day, David is desperate. He's run out of options. He knows there's no way that he's going to get Uriah and Bathsheba together. So what does he do? He writes a letter to Joab, his commander, knowing that Joab will do anything he tells him to do. And so he writes this letter devising the way that Uriah should die, and he sends it by the hand of Uriah. He knows that Uriah is a very, very loyal soldier who would never look in anyone else's mail. And so he tells Joab, put Uriah at the front of the battle. Leave him there. Put him there alone. Withdraw everybody else. David wants Uriah dead. And he arranged to make him a casualty of war, which he did become. And in verse 26, it says, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. In the end, Uriah's righteousness cost him his life. But did David know what this sin would do to Bathsheba? That every day she would be reminded about the horrible death her husband died as he fell and lay there dying. She thought he was thinking about her as he died, thinking that he had died a noble death. But Bathsheba then, or maybe not till chapter 12 when Nathan comes and approaches David, and later on as he writes Psalms 51, did she realize and know without a doubt that David had contrived all of this and actually caused the murder of her husband because of her adultery. You know, she goes through this, but after this, there's still judgment for the sin. It says in verse 27, the very last chapter, last verse of this chapter, it says, when her mourning was over, David sent and brought Bathsheba to his house, and she became his wife and a child and bore him a son. After the mourning period, which in those days was only 7 days, 1 week. 1 week later, David once again sends the messengers to get her. And she's brought to the palace to be the latest in a long line of the queen's wives. And this did one thing, though. It assured the legitimacy of their child. David played a central role, and Bathsheba, she may have been guilty of indiscretion in her modesty, and perhaps she made no effort to resist David's and his intent. But she was still a victim. She was a victim on the sidelines. We know that because of the very last sentence of the chapter, which says, But the Lord was displeased with the thing that David had done. It didn't say about Bathsheba. Bathsheba right here is seen as a victim. The prophet Nathan arrives in chapter 12, and he tells David that he has sinned, and in punishment the son of Bathsheba will die. David consoled Bathsheba by getting her pregnant again after that son died, and Solomon was born. And after that, there were 3 more sons. However, Bathsheba's story is far from over. It is through all these circumstances that she discovered her purpose for God. See, in addition to her supreme beauty, Bathsheba appears to have been a woman of superior talents. First of all, she was very prompt to speak up and tell the king about the pregnancy. I mean, he could have had her killed, and nobody ever would have found out about it then. Then she gave birth to the child that died, to King Solomon, but also to 3 more sons, to 5 children to David, more than any other wife that he had. And in 1 Chronicles 28:5, it tells us that God himself chose Bathsheba's son to be the king of Israel that would follow David. And when it came time, when it was almost the end of David's life, Bathsheba spoke up. She and the prophet Nathan, once again on the scene, saved the throne as one of the other sons from another wife tried to usurp the throne and take over. But she said, God has chosen him. And then she goes to David and said, because you made me a promise. She had a role in defeating this. Even after David died, she shared such a close relationship with her son Solomon. After his coronation, she crowned him with his wedding crown, according to the Song of Solomon. And then she had a seat of honor right beside him. He said to the guards, bring a throne for my mother and set it beside my throne. And he listened to her concerning matters of the kingdom. But it was more than just her actions. Her wisdom lives on for us in the words of Solomon, in Ecclesiastes, in Song of Solomon, in Proverbs. And especially in Proverbs 31, we hear the very words of Bathsheba herself. Bathsheba made a point to teach her son, in verses 8 and 9, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the right of all who are destitute. No one had spoken up for Bathsheba. No one had defended her rights when she suddenly was denied her life as the wife of Uriah, when she lost her first child, when she was stripped of her family and of her home. No one was there to speak up for her. Life did not go the way Bathsheba had planned for it to. But she discovered something more important. God had a purpose for her, despite the suffering. Yes, Bathsheba faced tragedy that's hard for me to comprehend and perhaps hard for you as well. You know, the murder of her husband, loss of a child and family and all of that, and then just being one of the king's wives. The list goes on and on. But Bathsheba was more than a victim of circumstances. She honored God. And through incredible suffering, Bathsheba remained faithful to God to the very end, as we can see in King Solomon's writings. Some of you have gone through some sufferings in your life, and you think, oh, I can relate to Bathsheba. I've been a victim. I've suffered. I've hurt. I need someone to defend me. Bathsheba knew God was her defense. Bathsheba knew that no matter what happened, that her name would be true. You know, the God of rest was who she was depending on. That was what her name meant. God is at rest. And she says, I am going to rest in God regardless of my circumstances. No matter what you're going through and how hard your life has been, God is there with you. And the end of your story will be much better than anything you can imagine. When Bathsheba had her hard times, she could never think that she would be known as the ancestor of Jesus Christ, the greatest of all, King of Kings and King of Israel. But that was the end of her story. God has a good end planned for you. Trust him and hope in that.